Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. It began with steam. From the hiss of the first pistons to the roar of engines that powered entire cities, the Industrial Revolution in Britain was more than a technological shift, it was a complete transformation of society. In mere decades, a nation of rural villages and manual labor was reshaped into a powerhouse of factories, machines, and relentless productivity. Cinematic visuals would show smoke rising over endless rows of red brick textile mills, children darting through coal-blackened streets, and sparks flying from iron forges. The rhythm of life itself changed, now dictated by the clatter of looms and the whistle of trains. This revolution touched every part of Britain, and soon, the world. Steam-powered railways cut across the countryside, stitching distant towns into a single economic system. Coal mines drilled deep into the earth to feed the insatiable hunger of industry. Wealth flowed like never before, and Britain's cities boomed with opportunity. But under this wave of innovation lay a darker reality. Children as young as 5 worked in dangerous conditions. Families lived crammed in filthy urban slums. Air, thick with soot and factory smoke, choked the lungs of workers. The progress was real, undeniable, even miraculous, but it was bought with sweat, suffering, and sacrifice. So as we journey through the rise of industrial Britain, one question echoes above the roar of engines and ambition: at what cost? Did this progress come in the early 1700s? Before the machines and the smoke, Britain was a quiet land of villages and farms. Life moved slowly, tied to the rhythm of the seasons. Most people lived in the countryside and worked in agriculture, using simple tools passed down through generations. Farming was the backbone of the economy, and entire families labored together in the fields. Beyond the farm, there was cottage industry, a system of small-scale production where families would spin wool or weave cloth in their homes. This was the domestic system, also known as the putting-out system, where merchants would deliver raw materials to rural households, and then collect the finished goods to sell in distant markets. It was a world powered by human hands, not machines, and transport was equally slow. Roads were rough and muddy, and it could take days to travel just a few dozen miles. Life was rooted, local, and largely unchanged for centuries. Then, something remarkable happened. Britain became the birthplace of a revolution that would ripple across the globe. But why Britain? The answer lies in a unique combination of geography, politics, wealth, and culture, a perfect storm of change. First, Britain had abundant natural resources, especially coal and iron. Coal powered the new steam engines, and iron was essential for building machines, tools, and infrastructure. These materials were located near each other, making them easy to mine and transport. Second, political stability played a crucial role. Unlike much of Europe, Britain had avoided major internal conflict after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It had a stable monarchy, growing parliamentary power, and a legal system that protected property and contracts, all essential for business to flourish. Additionally, Britain's vast colonial empire provided both raw materials and markets. Cotton from India and the American South, sugar from the Caribbean, and other colonial goods poured into British ports. These materials fed the growing industries, while colonial populations created global demand for British-made products. Capital was also plentiful. Wealth from trade, banking, and the expanding empire provided the funds to invest in factories, canals, and railways. But resources and money alone weren't enough. Technological innovation was the true engine of transformation. Thinkers, inventors, and tinkerers, inspired by the Enlightenment and a spirit of scientific curiosity, began to question traditional methods. James Watt improved the steam engine, Richard Arkwright pioneered the water frame, and countless others revolutionized production in textiles, mining, and transport, and at the heart of it all were Britain's entrepreneurs. These risk-takers saw opportunity in innovation. They built mills, hired workers, and transformed rural landscapes into industrial centers. They weren't just chasing profits. They were shaping the future. This convergence of resources, ideas, and ambition didn't happen by chance. It was the result of centuries of development, geography, and human ingenuity, a perfect storm that would turn Britain from a land of quiet farms into the world's first industrial superpower. The heartbeat of the Industrial Revolution was invention, bold, brilliant, and utterly transformative. At its core was a fundamental shift in how goods were produced. Before this era, making fabric was a slow, labor-intensive process, but one breakthrough after another rewrote the rules. One of the first game changers was the spinning jenny, invented by James Hargreaves in the 1760s. With this device, a single worker could spin multiple spools of thread at once, a huge leap from the traditional spinning wheel. It drastically increased productivity and marked the beginning of mechanized textile production. Then came Richard Arkwright's water frame, a large, water-powered spinning machine that required dedicated space and workers, the first real step toward modern factories. Samuel Crompton's spinning mule combined the best features of the earlier machines, producing finer and stronger thread. These innovations revolutionized the textile industry, especially cotton, making Britain the global leader in cloth production. But the revolution didn't stop with thread. At the center of it all was James Watt, who took the clunky early steam engine and, in the late 1700s, turned it into a reliable and efficient source of power. His improved steam engine wasn't just useful in mines, it became the driving force behind factories, locomotives, and ships. Suddenly, industries were no longer tied to water sources for power. Steam gave them freedom to grow anywhere. The power loom, invented by Edmund Cartwright, automated weaving and allowed for faster and more consistent textile production. Meanwhile, in America, Eli Whitney's cotton gin made separating cotton fibers from seeds vastly easier and quicker. This ensured a steady supply of raw cotton to feed the mills of Britain, especially those in places like Manchester. Another critical development came in metallurgy. As demand for stronger machines and infrastructure grew, the Bessemer process, developed in the 1850s, transformed how steel was made. By blowing air through molten iron to remove impurities, steel could be produced faster, cheaper, and in larger quantities. This advancement laid the foundation for railroads, bridges, and the skyscrapers of the future. With all this innovation came a radical transformation in where and how people worked. The traditional cottage industries, where work was done at home by hand, rapidly declined. In their place rose a new titan of production, the factory. These were massive buildings filled with machines that required large numbers of workers operating under strict schedules. Manchester emerged as the poster child of industrial progress, a once small town that exploded into a sprawling industrial city. It became known as Cottonopolis, the global center of textile manufacturing. Factory towns sprang up across Britain, drawing in people from rural villages who were eager, or desperate, for work. This migration caused urban populations to boom almost overnight. But life in these new industrial cities was far from glamorous. Workers, including women and children, toiled for 14 to 16 hours a day in poorly ventilated, dangerous environments. Child labor was rampant. Children as young as 5 were employed in coal mines or caught in the gears of machines they were too small to operate safely. Factory owners often paid them less than adults, yet worked them just as hard. Housing couldn't keep pace with the population surge. Families were crammed into filthy, overcrowded tenements. Open sewage, poor sanitation, and polluted air made cities breeding grounds for disease. The promise of progress came wrapped in soot, hardship, and sacrifice. Yet, this was the new industrial world. A world of machines, speed, and unimaginable output, but also one where human lives were often ground down in the gears of production. As Britain's industry surged, the need to move goods and people efficiently became critical, and so began the transport revolution, a pivotal chapter in the Industrial Revolution. At first, improvements came in the form of canals and turnpikes. Canals, man-made waterways, connected industrial regions to ports and markets. These slow-moving but reliable routes dramatically lowered the cost of transporting heavy goods like coal, iron, and textiles. By the late 18th century, Britain was crisscrossed with a growing network of canals, such as the Bridgewater Canal, often called the first modern canal, which linked Manchester's factories to Liverpool's ports. At the same time, toll roads or turnpikes improved land travel. Private companies maintained these roads and charged users for passage, ensuring better upkeep than older, muddy tracks. But while canals and toll roads laid the groundwork, they were soon overshadowed by the true star of the transport revolution, the railway. The development of the steam-powered locomotive was a game-changer. In 1829, George Stephenson's rocket stunned crowds by reaching speeds of 30 miles per hour, unheard of at the time. It was chosen to run the Liverpool-Manchester Railway, the world's first passenger railway to operate with scheduled services, dedicated tracks, and steam locomotives. This line connected a booming industrial city, Manchester, to a vital shipping port, Liverpool, slashing travel times and transforming commerce. Raw materials, finished goods, and people could now move faster and more affordably than ever before. Railways reshaped Britain's landscape and economy. They stimulated coal and iron industries, enabled perishable food to be transported to cities, and gave rise to urban expansion, as workers could live farther from their factories. Towns with railway stations flourished, those without were left behind. For the first time in history, people could commute, travel for leisure, or send goods across the country in a single day. This mobility revolution not only boosted trade but also changed how people viewed time and distance. But while steam and steel drove economic power, the social cost of the revolution was becoming painfully clear. The rise of the factory system created a massive new group, the working class. These were the laborers, men, women, and children, who toiled in mills, mines, and foundries. Their lives were governed by the factory whistle, their value measured in output. This wasn't just a change in work, but a total reordering of society. Urban growth exploded as millions moved from rural areas to industrial towns. But housing couldn't keep up. Families were forced into overcrowded slums, often with no running water or sanitation. Entire streets shared a single outhouse. Diseases like cholera and tuberculosis ran rampant in these conditions. Infant mortality was high, and life expectancy in cities often dropped below 30 years. At the same time, a new class was rising, the industrial middle class, or bourgeoisie. These were the factory owners, bankers, merchants, and professionals who benefited most from industrialization. They built large homes away from the smoky factories, sent their children to school, and influenced local politics. For them, the revolution was a pathway to wealth, status, and comfort, but their prosperity stood in stark contrast to the suffering of the laborers beneath them. This growing inequality gave birth to resentment and resistance. One of the most famous early labor movements was the Luddites, a group of skilled textile workers who, fearing the loss of their livelihoods to machines, began destroying industrial equipment in protest during the early 1810s. Though often portrayed as anti-technology, their actions were really about survival and justice in a system that valued machines over men. These early struggles hinted at deeper tensions that would define the 19th century: class division, labor rights, and the fight for dignity in the machine age. The Industrial Revolution created immense wealth, but it also carved deep social rifts that would take generations to address. As the Industrial Revolution matured, so too did the voices demanding justice. The grinding conditions of factory life, the exploitation of children, and the glaring inequality between rich industrialists and impoverished workers could no longer be ignored. Reform was no longer just a moral plea, it was becoming a political necessity. In the early 19th century, the British government began passing factory acts, slowly acknowledging the inhumanity of unchecked industrial labor. The Factory Act of 1833 was a turning point. It limited the working hours of children, banned the employment of those under 9 in textile mills, and mandated basic schooling for young workers. Later acts addressed working hours for women and improved safety standards, though enforcement was often weak. Still, these early labor laws marked the beginning of the state's involvement in industrial society, a stark shift from earlier laissez-faire attitudes. Meanwhile, workers were not passive. They organized. The Chartist movement, which emerged in the late 1830s, was one of the most powerful working-class movements in British history. Chartists demanded universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and parliamentary reform, not just better working conditions, but a voice in how the country was run. Though their petitions were rejected multiple times, the Chartists laid the groundwork for democratic reforms that would follow later in the century. Labor unions also began to take shape. At first, they were illegal and met in secret, but over time, their influence grew. Workers began to collectively bargain for better wages and safer conditions. Strikes, though often risky, became tools for change. These efforts were slow and hard-won, but they gradually improved the lives of industrial laborers. These movements also sparked a shift in ideology. Early industrial capitalism, once celebrated as the engine of progress, came under scrutiny. Thinkers like Karl Marx began to critique the deep class divisions it produced. Philosophers, writers, and reformers started to ask hard questions. Should profit come before people? Was poverty an inevitable price for progress? The Industrial Revolution didn't just reshape factories, it reshaped the way people thought about economics, power, and justice. While Britain wrestled with these questions at home, its industrial might was echoing far beyond its borders. The technologies and systems pioneered in Britain were rapidly exported to Europe and North America. Countries like Germany, France, and the United States began building their own factories, railroads, and financial empires, often following Britain's model. The spread of industrialization created new centers of power and competition, setting the stage for a century of rapid global change. Britain's industrial appetite also fueled colonial expansion. The empire needed raw materials, cotton, rubber, tin, tea, and new markets to sell its manufactured goods. Colonies were reshaped to serve these demands. Railways were built not for local development, but to extract resources more efficiently. Indigenous industries were often destroyed by the flood of cheap British goods. Colonization and industrialization became deeply intertwined, as Britain extended its influence across Asia, Africa, and beyond. By the mid-19th century, Britain had earned the title, the workshop of the world. Its goods filled global markets, its technologies influenced foreign policy, and its empire spanned continents. But this global reach came with a cost. It marked the beginning of mass environmental change and global inequality. Deforestation, air and water pollution, and rising carbon emissions became global issues, rooted in the industrial practices pioneered in Britain. Entire societies were reshaped, some uplifted, others exploited. The Industrial Revolution started as a national transformation, but it quickly became a world-altering force. Its legacy is everywhere, in the cities we live in, the jobs we do, the way we think about progress, and the inequalities that still persist. It was the birth of the modern world, and like all births, it came with both pain and possibility. The closing chapter of Britain's Industrial Revolution is not just a story of triumph, but one of reckoning. For all its innovation and economic growth, the cost of progress was immense, and often invisible in the glow of industry cities. Choked on coal smoke, a permanent haze hanging over factory towns. Rivers, once lifelines for communities, became conduits for chemical waste, dyed black with ink, red with blood, or foaming with discarded chemicals. The natural world was sacrificed for the rhythm of machines, and for the first time in history, humans began to fundamentally alter the Earth's environment at scale. For those living in the shadow of the smokestacks, the price was personal. Factory workers developed chronic illnesses from long exposure to dust, chemicals, and poor air. The urban poor suffered from malnutrition, overcrowding, and epidemics, while child labor left thousands physically stunted or maimed. There was no safety net. A lost hand or a collapsed lung often meant the end of a life's work. Beyond the physical toll, the Industrial Revolution raised profound moral questions. Could it be justified that some grew fabulously rich off the backbreaking labor of children? That entire regions of the world were colonized, their resources stripped to feed British factories? That profit was prioritized so ruthlessly over people? The era forced society to confront new realities, not just of what machines could do, but what kind of world they were building. And yet, out of the soot and suffering emerged something entirely new. A modern society. The Industrial Revolution reshaped economics, introducing capitalism at a scale never seen before. It restructured politics, giving rise to labor movements, democratic reforms, and new ideologies like socialism. It changed how people worked, lived, traveled, and even thought. It made Britain a global power, but it also exposed the fragility of empires built on inequality. Its legacy is everywhere. In the layout of cities, the pace of our workdays, the global supply chains that define our economy. The same revolution that darkened the skies over Manchester also paved the way for electricity, mass communication, medicine, and modern rights movements. It was both the beginning of prosperity and the origin of modern problems: climate change, urban poverty, global economic divides. And as we look back on it, one truth becomes clear: the Industrial Revolution didn't just change machines, it changed mankind.